this whole thing of memes. An image and a very sort of an inscription, a very short verbal presentation of an idea with an image working together. I see very much of a magical component to that. And the best resistance to this is to learn about how it works. Mm-hmm. Just like you learn about how advertising works. And then, of course, advertising, when you see it on television or whatever, doesn't particularly work on your mind anymore. You see what they're doing, so you see the man behind the curtain.
Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth.
I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode, I am joined by Dr. Stephen Flowers to discuss his latest book, The Occult in National Socialism, the Symbolic, Scientific, and Magical Influences on the Third Reich. Dr. Flowers debunks some of the misconceptions that have grown around occult influences of National Socialism. He also discusses its volkish foundations, the dangers of othering, propaganda as magic, and so much more. Also, please be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. Your support is truly appreciated. Stephen Flowers, PhD, received his doctorate in Germanic languages and medieval studies from the University of Texas at Austin and studied the history of occultism and runology at the University of Göttingen. He is the author of more than 50 books, including Revival of the Ruins, and his latest publication is The Occult in National Socialism, the Symbolic, Scientific, and Magical Influences on the Third Reich. Dr. Flowers, welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'm happy to have you here, and I am very much looking forward to this conversation. I really enjoyed your book, The Occult in National Socialism, and I think it's a very important book. It's a serious work of scholarship, and I think you correct a lot of false information regarding the Third Reich and occultism. And I also wanted to add, I think you make some really valuable insights along the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So I feel compelled to do this. And at the beginning of the book, you write a note to the reader. And I want to do something similar here for the audience, just because of the world we live in today. You give a note to the reader that you are not a National Socialist. You are not a Nazi. You are not promoting Nazi ideology, and neither is this podcast. I am not a National Socialist or a Nazi either. Your book is a serious piece of scholarship, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to be as objective as humanly possible. And I think you did a good job at it. So I just wanted to be clear about that from the very beginning. So I thought we would start with the kind of a background here. There has been this sort of ongoing, I'm going to use myth here, and we can talk a little bit later about how you use the term myth in the book, but there's this kind of myth of the Nazi program as being deeply, deeply embedded in occultism. And you note some books, Trevor Ravencroft's The Spear of Destiny and The Morning of the Magicians by, is it Louis Apoels and Jacques Bergier? Bergier. Okay, yeah. Thank you. And I know that there are videos on YouTube about this, and there's even on Amazon. And you say all of this is very sensationalistic. Mm-hmm. And I think your book is trying to unpack and get at the truth of things. But you also say, and I think this is one of the most important points in my money that you make in this book, is that this is a kind of a diversion. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could speak to what kind of diversion is it?
Well, if we can blame the devil or kind of occult, mysterious, sinister forces in the universe that are hiding behind that tree over there, then the finger for when someone says, "Oh, the Nazis, that's evil, that's terrible," I will ask sometimes, well, what's so evil? But what did they do that's so evil that sets them apart? And of course, it will come down to correctly Auschwitz and mass murder of the Jewish people, et cetera, and all our other people, all kinds of situations. Okay. Well, where did that motive, when you look at it, it's a crime against humanity. It is a crime. Well, let's approach a crime like a FBI profiler approaches a criminal. What motivates them? How do they do it? What's behind it? What is the mindset? It would be mind hunters and say, who are these people and why did they do what they did, individually, collectively, et cetera. And we do the history of anti-Semitism and the direction of that sort of thing. Well, you have to look back to the Middle Ages. You don't look to pagans or Satanists for a motive to be anti-Semitic. It's to Christianity. It is to the churches of Europe, whether it's the Russian Orthodox, the Roman Catholics, centuries and centuries of programmatic anti-Semitism conditioned the European mind to accept this sort of criminality. But yet those people those people who are actually culpable will always divert it, point it away, say, oh, it's the devil that did it, or it's this cult that did it, et cetera, because the thing they fear the most is having the finger pointed at the actual criminal, historically speaking. And so without the Middle Ages and its legacy, Auschwitz would have been impossible. People would have seen, this is ridiculous. What are you talking about? This is ludicrous. But it all fit because of centuries of conditioning in this direction. And the thing that set the Nazis apart to a great extent is their incredible technology and scientific acumen in the commission of these crimes. The Russian Tsar probably would have used the same thing, but all he had were Cossacks at his command for pogroms and such things. But that's probably just a lack of technology. You know, his motive and direction in that story would be similar. So
yeah, well, I appreciate all of that, and I teach religious studies, and that's something that I always point out in the class. I'm like, especially, I say, there's no mistake that Nazi Germany was also the land of Luther, and Luther, was horribly anti-Semitic. One of his books was The Jews and Their Lies. And something I learned out of your book that I never knew, or maybe I forgot, I don't know, but that the Kristallnacht was meant to coincide with Luther's birthday.
Right. Yeah, that is absolutely correct. And of course, also the theme of vengeance, as far as understanding the whole Nazi motivation is important. That's why the V weapons, right? It just so happens that vengeance and Vergeltung, German word for vengeance, start with the same letter. So that's why the V1, V2, etc. And when Hitler didn't decide we are going to liquidate the Jews, we are going to do that until Pearl Harbor, when the United States declared war on Germany. That was the moment when it went from standard kind of repression, concentration camps to an actual mass murder agenda, because he was of the belief that about this Jewish conspiracy and such that caused Germany to lose the First World War. And that's the thing he could never, ever forget. And that's what motivated him and the Nazis, because those were all World War I veterans who felt betrayed by how that war ended, because they weren't defeated in battle, yet they lost their whole country and as such. So they were feeling very betrayed. And that's something that we learned, of course, when we were smarter. Our government was smarter. At the end of the Second World War, we did very good programs to change the cultures of both Japan and Germany, who were, we have to face it, they were war-like nations. And through the smart application of foreign policy and not doing what we did at the end of the First World War, we preserved the peace very, very well. with those nations, certainly. But that sense of betrayal that really fueled that passion, that hate, you know.
I think that,
and the idea of the Jewish conspiracy as being the source of our misery is again a medieval notion towards the so-called the Jews being the killers of Christ, right?
Right.
And so that whole thing, that's where it starts and it doesn't end.
Right.
So coming up with new excuses for it, but the same thing.
Yeah. Well, there was, the ancient blood libel that Jews were sacrificing Christian children. And, one of the classes I teach is critical thinking, and I teach logic as well. And there's the logical fallacy of poisoning the well. And I always kind of give the history of that because that fallacy goes back to the time of the Black Plague, where people were saying that it was Jews that were poisoning the water wells.
Sure.
So
they were blamed for any misfortune. And then see where it comes down to the religious dimension of how the medieval Christian mind is that there is no power but of God, so says Paul, right? And so God is in control of everything. So therefore, if anything bad happens, it's either because God is visiting it upon us to punish us. Why? For our lack of faith, for our sin. Attila the Hun was called the scourge of God. What does that mean? Well, he was here to whip the population, to punish them. He was sent by God to punish the unfaithful and so forth. So everything that happened was God's will. God did it or allowed it. And so if the Jews are, so they say, why are we being punished? Well, one of the popular answers was, we're allowing the Jews to be among us. We're allowing the Jews to live. God really mandates that we not do so. The Anglo-Saxon, the ancient English kings, one part of their oath was to avenge Christ, to avenge the death of Christ. It was one of their items in their oath. So it's just so deeply ingrained that it becomes to be the explanation. It's like a person who is constantly programmed by his environment, his parents, his school, whatever, to think a certain way. And when given the opportunity, they act on those thoughts. And it works historically and collectively as well.
Yeah. In preparation for this interview, I was speaking with a friend of mine who I went to grad school with, and she took a class on the Holocaust. And this was taught by a Jewish professor. And one of the things that he observed is that because of this background that we're talking about, that the Holocaust could have happened pretty much anywhere in Europe. I think what set Germany apart is, several other things, but primarily what you were talking about is the effects of World War I and how that ended, But I think that's important to keep in mind, that this could have happened anywhere. And I think that, we always need to look at ourselves in the mirror rather than pointing outwards all the time.
But people don't, because some people love to harp on these facts or these ideas because people like to, some self-flagellation about America is not so great, that kind of line of thinking. But, it is true that most of the eugenics programs that the Nazis used were taken directly from American ideologues. Hitler had a portrait behind his desk of Henry Ford. Henry Ford was his hero. Henry Ford wrote a whole great work that was in the Dearborn newspaper and then put into a book form called The International Jew. And his hero worship of Ford went so far as to say, well, Ford made a car for the people. So I want to make a car for the people. That's the birth of the Volkswagen, the people's car. So, he was a total programmatic enactment of those ideas. But they weren't necessarily German ideas. They were used and adopted. So that's blame lies where it lies. But the the ideas were pre-thought out by other people and imported.
Right. And let's kind of dig in a little bit to kind of move the conversation to some of the bigger parts of the book, because you note that, there is this diversion, and that, focusing on the pagan or occult influences is the kind of diversion. But there are some influences that come in. And,
Sure.
in the subtitle of the book, you've got the symbolic, the scientific, and the magical. So I thought, maybe we can dig in into each one of these a little bit, and let's just take them in order, I guess.
Yeah.
and and the other thing that I think we should probably address is the volkish movement as well, because I think that's the fourth aspect here. So I'm not entirely sure what is the best place to start. Do you want to start with the volkish movement or with the symbolic? You're the expert,
Yeah.
so I'm going to let you
Yeah.
kind of
Okay.
choose the best place to dig in.
The volkish is a German word, of course, but it's the international word for that idea is nationalist. That's why the Nazi Party is called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And I hear this word, Nazis, thrown around constantly. It's folkloristic at this point to say anybody you don't agree with, they're a Nazi. Okay, so I thought, well, I really need to define Nazi in very clear terms. And one of the best ways to do that is to actually put the points of the National Socialist program and say, here's what they stood for, just so that you can see the whole dimension. But it's summed up in the name of the party, national. That German word for that is folkish. It means that it is a biological construct, not a political construct, but a biological one. Well, people of common birth, the Latin word natio, I am born. And it's the source of our word for natural, innate, all of these cognates to Latin national. So National Socialist, the common good before the individual good. That's how they define it in the program. German, where, by the way, that's just so that you'll know, it's German nation, German folk that we're talking about, to exclude others. And to be and then they define who is a German folk member. They are Christians. It is defined there. It says Christian. Why do they use that? To explicitly exclude the Jews. So you had to be a Christian. They favor, it says in there, positive Christianity. We may get into that or not, but it's a specific kind of view of Christianity, which doesn't mean just upbeat and positive, but rather it's historically accurate according to their dogma or doctrine.
Right. Yeah, I did want to get into that. I have that as one of my questions, is the positive Christianity.
That's, they explicitly in the program say you've got to be Christian, you've got to be, a German, and so forth. These are all, in these few words, defines really their whole worldview and how it can be understood. Then you have to be a worker. That is not earn your money or get your money from things like earning interest. That's not a worker. You have to, again, explicitly says you must work with your hands or with your mind, but you must work, which is also typical of socialism, of Marxist socialism. People forget that part of that back in the day, it was illegal in the Soviet Union, for example, to be unemployed. You had to be employed, and so that sort of, you had to be a worker, and it's a party, it's a organization with a membership. Only 10% perhaps of the people in Germany, just like in the Soviet Union, only about 10% of the population were ever members of the National Socialist Party. It was something you had to earn your way into, be invited into. It was a exclusive group, as was the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. It was not, oh, yeah, we're all communists. We're all members of the Communist Party. No, you have to be invited to that. You're in with the in crowd. You are the new aristocracy based on ideology, biology, whatever their criteria are. And so folkish things is a biological construct and understood as that. And they believed that everything about a person was determined by genetics, biology, race, if you will, etc. Their character, their ability, their everything. Of course, it's just, again, that is an occult idea. There is no objective scientific evidence for such a belief that your spiritual value, your intellectual value, everything about you that's important is determined by race. That was their fundamental belief there. And that's part of this sort of folkish idea in the Nazi mentality. Now, the Nazis were a generational phenomenon. Germany at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century was a land enamored with the idea of reform. The so-called reform movements were incredibly powerful. The ideas from nudism to natural foods to organic, alternative communities, all the things we associate in this country, especially with the 60s, the whole hippie movement. It's what was something that was in the air and in everything in Germany and Central Europe at the beginning about 1880. And all of the Nazi leaders were born most of them in the 1890 thereabouts. And so they were born into this kind of thinking. The Nazis were rabid anti-vivisectionists. They believed Goering was like on fire for this idea of prevention of animal cruelty and so forth. Now, they would experiment on humans, concentrate, but not animals, That was, they really had an aversion to that. Why? Hitler himself was a teetotaling anti-vivisectionist, vegetarian.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
All of those
vegetarian.
All those characteristics were part of this reform movement. They weren't Nazi ideas, although they promoted them and thought they were good. They didn't mandate them, except the animal cruelty thing became law. And the German laws against animal cruelty are essentially unchanged from, the Nazi era because they were good ones. They were very good laws to prevent this kind of thing. And they also believed that cruelty or bad conditions for your animals that you were going to slaughter and eat, if you were going to do that, eating them conveyed to you sickness, every kind of sickness, bad health, cancer, whatever, or just spiritual illness. So these were kind of ideas that were part of the whole mentality. So, and these things all played into this idea of folkishness, that this was the German way, the German culture and ideas and so forth. So it's always a mistake when you're thinking about individual people or countries and nations to demonize people, say, oh, they're just evil, totally evil. The propaganda against Germany during the war is what you might expect, but things like there was this occultist named Louis Spence in England, and he wrote a book called The Occult Causes of the Present War, and it was like a super popular, but that's where the genesis of a lot of the strange beliefs about Nazi occultism are generated. But he comes out and says things like, well, he analyzes Hitler's lack of character based on the structure of his face and skull, and says that the Germans it's totally Nazi thinking on the part of an Englishman, right? But it's totally and fundamentally racist, and just like what a Nazi would say about one of their demons or bugaboos, he says about the Nazis. So this Nazi kind of thinking is something everyone is prone to, but when you then say only Nazis are bad, that then, talking about this diversion idea, that then liberates current criminal activities and say, well, we may be doing awful, terrible things, but at least we're not Nazis. Don't call us that. We're not that, because that's like Satan himself, and so we're not that. So therefore we're somehow innocent and we're above reproach because we're not that. And that's a dangerous way of thinking in my mind, so that you then don't see the similar kinds of patterns when they manifest in your midst. And
Right.
so that's part of the use of this demonization of the Nazis. It's curious to see that a lot of this, we might think, or a lot of people think, that the German people continue to be, and they are the only ones that believe this, apparently, in the denazification program that we did there. We said, oh, you're bad, you're warlike, you're this, that, and the other, and they kind of believe it even to this day. But the BBC does a survey of national image of all countries, or most countries of the world. And the German nation, the German people, come out at the highest level on these surveys, or international surveys run by the BBC, about their honesty, their hardworkingness, all these kind of characteristics. And Germans come at the far and away at the top of all of these lists. So the image that sometimes some people might have of Germany and Germans doesn't stick. It's the Nazis. And it was kind of the way I grew up. I'm a kid of the generation. All of my friends were all World War II veterans for the most part. So we were the sons of people who fought in the war. And it was very clear, we got at our homes, that the Germans weren't bad, the Nazis were bad. Typically in the American wartime propaganda, the Japanese people were often demonized. Even the cartoons, when I was growing up, we still were watching cartoons from the 40s, on TV. And the way they portrayed the Japanese people was very racist, but the Germans, not so. It was very clear. Of course, half of our own army were Germans ethnically, Eisenhower himself. So that didn't really affect things as much as one might think. Although at the time, especially among the English, and one of the things that came about, as a kid, I learned this. So why are the Germans and Nazis so bad? Well, they thought they were a master race, and of course, it's implied that everyone knows we are the master race, the English or the American or whatever. It wasn't that the idea was bad, or incorrect, but to be an idea, but it was the fact that they were so arrogant. And so arrogant that they think they are that when everyone knows we are. You know what I mean? It wasn't that the idea wasn't. It was misapplied.
Right.
And so thus becomes a motive for fighting and so forth. Yeah. So there was a lot of that sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's a really important point, this sort of otherizing of others. And that's something that really came out in your book is, that we're kind of engaged, people who do that are engaging in the same activity that the Nazis did by sort of dehumanizing the others. And, and I think your point with, this sort of saying the Germans is arrogant, what came to my mind is, that manifest destiny is kind of arrogant if you stop and think about it. And it's also connected to genocide.
Yes, of course. Yes. And even the idea of a popular word that's on everybody's lips nowadays is white and whiteness, etc. Right. And that is really a Saxon English category. The Americans considered Germans as not being white.
Right.
The Anglo-Saxon, the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants of America, they are the ones that started using this word as the way it's used. And there was something on the internet I saw not too long ago, a photograph of a woman on a porch, and it was in California actually, and it has a big banner sign that says, Slavs move on. This is a white neighborhood.
Wow.
It's like that. So it's not the fact that you have blonde hair, blue eyes, and pale skin. That doesn't make you white.
Right.
Not in the Anglo-Saxon, mentality of the colonial period. I guess we could, say that.
Yeah.
But and so it's not something peculiar to Germans for sure.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things before we move to something else, I wanted to ask in relation to the or Volkism, you refer to symbolic Volkism.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could say a few words about what that is. In my notes here, I've got, I think it's identity, solidarity, and purpose, and then the National Socialist Party and Hitler. But I wanted to see if you could maybe expand upon my notes there.
Sure. Well, folkism is, to my way of thinking, is primarily a symbolic quality. And as a symbolic quality, it is not necessarily a negative, bad, or criminal thing at all. I mean, it is the myth. We have a common history. Let's say a people like the Germans, Anglo-Saxons, etc., have a common language, history, mythology. We have our own gods. We still invoke them on a weekly basis. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the old Germanic gods, there they are, still alive, etc. So these are symbolic things that make for an identity and a quality of symbolic environment or religion, if you will, in the sense that it's a culture, just like you have things in nations such as Japan. You have everything is Japanese. The language is Japanese. The religion, you have the Japanese religion, or when we talk about history and talk about Greek mythology, Greek religion, Greek language, it all is a holistic, symbolic thing. Now, where the Nazis got completely off track with this is that they started, in the wake of Darwin and 19th century science and evolution, started to think in totally and exclusively biological terms. But that is detrimental and bad, and it will not work. When you say, "Oh, I can't associate with this person because of their biology is wrong." A great example historically is the nation or the culture of Egypt, of ancient Egypt. We look back on them and say, well, some of the pharaohs and so forth, some of them were Nubians or Libyans, Greeks later on, but they were all considered Egyptian because they adhered to and were a part of Egyptian culture, religions. The symbolic world of Egypt held everyone together as Egyptians, despite or with no respect to or little respect to ethnicity. And that's really the way most cultures in antiquity worked. That's where the Greeks absorbed gods from all kinds of different people and made them Greek. And most peoples, when you look at them historically, the way they really interacted with their environment, socially, culturally, etc., were very inclusive. I was trained very much in Indo-European thought and scholarship. And there we see that the Indo-European people, so often demonized as conquerors and so forth and so on, were the most xenophilic people you can ever imagine, because they always, well, they came to a place, they did take it over, but they interacted on every level, including marriage and everything else, with the local population. They made them a part of what they were doing. And this came about, their conquest, if you will, their success, let's use that word. Their success came about not through coercion, although that could be a part of it, but through prestige. They did things from fighting to sacrificing to everything in a more prestigious way, in a way that people wanted to imitate because it was more successful and more beautiful and so forth. It just won people over almost universally. And that's the languages and other things, religion, mythologies, don't change permanently through acts of coercion and violence. They change and evolve in accordance with prestige. And so you can't, just like in the Soviet Union, if you say you must do this, and if you do not do this, behave like this, you will be put in a gulag or whatever. Well, people shut up. They do what they're told, but their minds aren't changed. You know, they don't come to believe that. Even the party members didn't believe it. You know, it was a racket, and that's one of the things that I try to impress, not over and over, but that groups like the Bolsheviks or the Nazis, et cetera, are best understood if you understand how gangland works, how gangsterism works. Because that's where people like, you can see the Nazis' behavior, how they looted art, they did this, they did that. They're behaving like a bunch of gangsters, you know, and enriching themselves and so forth, and confiscating people's property, especially the Jewish people, et cetera, and taking it over for themselves. It was a complete racket, you know. And that's what motivates and moves a lot of these people to do what they do, is personal, individual power and wealth. And power is greater than wealth because they own the whole land. They own the whole country. They can do anything they want with anyone or anything in it. And so that's the biggest racket of all. You know, you don't have to worry about this turf or that or this kind of scam or that. We take it all over. Yeah. And so that's one of the things that people, I think, would be very valuable to understand about these political movements, because they get clouded in ideology, like, oh, the Nazis believe this or the Bolsheviks believe that, all couched in high-sounding ideas or idealism, etc. But that's not what moved those people individually or as a group.
Yeah. Now are you referring to just the leaders of the National Socialist Party or everyone? Because one of the questions I wanted to ask was about the use of symbols to persuade people. So, because I found your discussion of symbolism and connecting it to magic, I found really interesting. And at one point you referred to the Third Reich as an empire of applied symbology.
Right. Well, that's even in the worst kinds of totalitarian regimes one can imagine. Still, in the support and cooperation, willing, enthusiastic cooperation of the masses is absolutely essential. Because say that the party and its leadership constitute 10% of the population. Well, that's your army's going to be drawn from this, everything. No, you've got to control the masses as well, as much as possible, despite the fact that it's a one-party totalitarian state. They still want and need that. And of course, Hitler himself didn't take over, much to his chagrin. He wanted to be like Mussolini or something, and take over the government kind of by force. But he was reduced to having to do it in a democratic way, as they had at that time in the Weimar Republic. And so it wasn't force, it was political maneuvering. So he needed to be able to move the masses. One of the best features of this particular book is the section in there where I do a analysis, not of everything in it, but of his book Mein Kampf, and analyze it for occult uses and motivations and insights, which he has many, because he wrote the book basically to convince any would-be competitor or member of the party that he was the smartest man in the room and that no one could match him in his acumen with regard to these traits. And so he talks about things like we have our meetings at night because at night the mind of the masses is more susceptible to suggestion. Or our banners are red primarily, because I've noted how the communists have their red banners and they are really motivational. They really move the masses. So that color and the display of that color must be primary. These are the kinds of things that are in that book when they are purely occult ideas. But one of the great things I think that I try to point out is that a lot of the things when we define the occult as being an unestablished or disestablished idea in general, that a lot of the ideas that the Nazis pioneered with regard to all of this have become standard fare. And when you take a course in advertising or branding and all of that sort of thing, they mastered that. Essentially, Hitler mastered it because he was a designer. He designed the flag, he designed the swastika just the way it looked and so forth. So these are ways, very magical ways in which these logos and things like that and everything in the whole party apparatus was designed, how the uniforms looked like, the fact that there were uniforms, because see, that sends the message that we are disciplined, we are in control, we know what we are doing, we are a disciplined force. Party people wore uniforms, etc. And when you see the opposition, the Communist Party, they were just in the raggedy overcoats, nothing, no uniform in that sense in the time period where they were fighting in the streets. So the very fact that we have these uniforms and that we look this way is sending a semiotic message to the masses that, we can be trusted, we are in control, we are disciplined. And of course, most of them were veterans, so that's just kind of what they had in their closets left over.
Right.
But
yeah, I found that really important, and in the sense that when people, I think, typically think of magic, they think of, kind of specific rituals and maybe invocation of spirits and things like that. But, the way you wrote about this, I mean, number one, you said that Mein Kampf was the most powerful grimoire of the movement. And that I have your definition of magic here. It's the art of translating symbols, be it verbal or graphic, into phenomena, events, occurrences, or thoughts and feelings in a target object. And I wrote right underneath that, propaganda as magic.
Yeah. And Hitler was one of the books I have finished, and it will be published sometime soon. It is a whole study of the Weimar German, the so-called philosopher king of Weimar, a man named Ernst Schertl, whose book called Magie, Magic, was given to Hitler at 1923, just prior to the putsch and when he went into prison. And this book was found in the bunker. He had it with him to the end with annotation or just of things that were highlighted in the book. Now, Ernst Schertl, this is my most important thing about him, is that he was not a Nazi. He was stripped of his PhD in philosophy and persecuted by the Nazis, and he was absolutely no way, shape, or form sympathetic to the Nazis. He was a sexual liberation guy and all this, but Hitler used this book. And so in my book about him, I introduce and put a whole thing in context and translate the book in question, which has been translated, but by R2-D2 or some other robot. So it's like a very bad translation. So anyway, persons like that and thoughts like that, the magical, actual occult magical thoughts did play a part. When you read Mein Kampf, this guy has read things like this, and he's aware of how it works. But he's not going to be out. You won't find Hitler, in the basement somewhere, invoking Satan or ringing bells and lighting candles. These magical operations were massive, and you can see films of it. Let's see Triumph of the Will, see the staging of the people and the use of mass movement, just the movement. I remember as a kid, a little kid in elementary school, getting a strange feeling when we'd have fire drills. You know, they would march us out in columns into the field outside the church, outside the school, etc. And just seeing people moving in columns and in a kind of a disciplined, orderly way has an effect on the mind. And so you can see their rituals were full of that sort of thing. And some of the rituals that they designed and created, we still love today. Example, the torch relay for the Olympics and the lighting of the Olympic torch were invented by the Nazis.
Wow.
And we still do them because it's a really cool ritual, you know? So, but that's the kind of thing they did. They thought about every detail of how they're presenting their program and their agenda to the people. And so that's how the magic works. So logos, branding, appearances of symbols in action and motion and all of these things were something that they were, very aware of. It wasn't just Hitler. A lot of Himmler and others were deeply into the same kind of things. So,
yeah. Well, and I think that's another point in terms of the period where we are now and the concerns often of a new, that there will be a repeat, right, of this.
mm-hmm.
And I've been thinking for a long time that these logos and everything that you mentioned, that these are a form of magic, that they are influencing how we think. And I feel that to avoid repeating the atrocities of the past, we have to focus not just on the anti-Semitism, but we have to look within, but also look at how we're being manipulated as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this whole thing of memes. An image and a very sort of an inscription, a very short verbal presentation of an idea with an image working together. I see a very much of a magical component to that. And the best resistance to this is to learn about how it works. Mm-hmm. Just like you learn about how advertising works. And then, of course, advertising, when you see it on television or whatever, doesn't particularly work on your mind anymore. You see what they're doing. So you see the man behind the curtain, and so you render the whole operation impotent. It only works on unconsciously. Now, the two sides of that are that one, somebody could just be unaware of what's going on, and so they don't pay attention, and so it works on them. The other and more sinister side is that people might know that it's working, but they simply choose to ignore it and choose to embrace it regardless of what they know. And I have a little section in there just to highlight the power of embracing weird ideas. I see this on the internet all the time, that people will, this person must know better than to espouse what he's just said. Right. But it's just there's a romance of just embracing something that's so strange and weird that makes the person embracing it feel special and apart and elite, because they have this weird idea. And then, of course, the others don't have it, which is the truth, the hidden, unknown truth. And so I am better than they are. And I have this special power because of how do you know that? Well, it's so weird, it's got to be something grand and special. And I'm not saying that whole construct I just threw out there is something that's totally illegitimate, evil, bad, or whatever, but it is something to consider.
Yeah.
When you choose to believe what you believe.
Yeah.
Where does it go?
Well, Yeah. Well, there are a couple ways that I think about that. And one is I have grown increasingly wary of ideas of awakening and enlightenment, because that is always associated with, at least with the people who make those claims, with knowledge and certainty. And I'm always really concerned with that. And where I'm at right now is I just embrace the uncertainty. And it's like,
Right.
take the idea of Socrates, the only thing I know is that I do not know.
Right.
But the other thing I wanted to comment with what you were just saying is something that came to mind is, and this bothers me a lot, is kind of going back to the advertising and the magical effects of advertising, is the Super Bowl commercials. How so many people will tune in just to watch the commercials. And I'm like, but do you understand what's happening here? There's,
Yeah.
and I don't know that they do. But it bothers me in a very deep level. And I have to admit that I loathe football, but I also don't like commercials. So,
It's all bad. But yeah, well, that's where you will, if you look at advertising before World War II and after, you will see, how they. Well, you remember that? Did you watch it's a great television, whatever network it was on, Mad Men? Did you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. There was a moment in there at the early part is about, Hitler and something, about psychology and Freud and, Don Draper just throws it in the trash. But then, of course, at the end, right, he's sitting there, he's bringing the Coca-Cola commercial I could teach the world to sing. That's the punchline of the whole thing. So it's very Mad Men. This Madison Avenue is reluctantly drug into practicing these arts, or because they were just like ordinary Joes of advertising, but then they, you start to, because you are trying to become persuasive. Move a person, say, I have this dollar in my pocket. I want to get it out of your pocket and put it in my pocket, and this is how I'm going to do it, through this advertising. Then it could be a vote, it could be your dollar, it could be some, but the game is the same.
I really wish more people would be aware of the magic that is operating on all of us, I think. So we've talked about the symbolic. The scientific is I think you've talked about that in terms of the technology, but also in things like the biology. And there was, would you put the ideas of eugenics, homeopathy, I think would fit into this as well?
Sure. Alternative, and that fits with the whole reform, movements and everything like that. But yeah.
Now, is there anything else in the science? Because in my notes here, I have a couple of things like unusual theories of physics and geology and pseudo-archaeology. Did all of those affect or influence the development of National Socialism as well?
Sure, because the people wanted, going back to the idea of, they were revolting against what they felt like the establishment, which they then identified with oftentimes Jewish thinking, science, etc. For example, Einstein, you say, well, that Einstein, that's Jewish physics. So we have to have an alternative to relativity and to Einstein, because like people are crazy. They'll like think like, well, a Jewish person came up with it, therefore it's a product of his Jewishness, so it's bad. So again, program for failure. But so we have to look for another alternative, Aryan physics, and they were thinking like that. So therefore, you have people like Hans Herbiger, the whole world glacial ice theories and whatever, but become attractive, right? They wish it were true, and so they might push it just as a way to, again, oppose the other, and as they've defined him, and to promote themselves and contrast, etc. But these are occult ideas with occult agendas, in the sense that we're trying to reconstruct your mind and oppose our enemies and such things. So then it becomes, well, there was this, like in the Morning of the Magicians, the sources they were using, that there were these world of advanced technology, Atlantis, some previous aeon of the world, where the Aryan peoples were on the mountaintops. The great deluge came, and on mountaintops they were preserving themselves in Tibet and in the Andes. And so then they would look into these regions for signs of this previous civilization and that sort of thing. And they spent resources delving into that. Of course, a lot of this was not too much of it, because before the war started, there was just a few years, and then in 1939, it becomes totally focused on the war effort, But they had, and a lot of the occult ideas of science are like post-war mythology. That's one of the aspects of the book that I created or made for the structure of it, was the idea of, okay, Nazi occultism. Let's look at that. It's got to be in the time period. There's a lead up, a historical root of it all, then the actual how it was enacted in the time of National Socialism, from the inception of the party about 1920 to its demise in 1945. Then there's a whole other world of Nazi occultism, which is post-war reception of all of these ideas. Some of them pro-Nazi, like, oh yeah, well, this is great. We want to be just like that. We want to emulate it. We want to do it. And then some of them, of course, like Trevor Ravenscroft or Morning of the Magicians or whatever, are great warnings. These are evil people. Everything about them is evil. Look at how occult and strange and satanic it all was. That kind of thing. But in any event, it's mythologies and new mythologies. Now, the whole UFO, Nazis had flying saucers, and such things. Now, they had incredible technologies, and some of them were enacted and some of them were just nothing but prototypes. But if you watch the war in Iraq and how our wonder weapons we used in that war, you will see in general, and before that as well, but these are all things that we got the idea from the Nazis for. Things like cruise missiles, V-1 rocket. Of course, ICBM was already the V-2 rocket. Okay, but other things like smart bombs. The Nazis had smart bombs. They had video-guided bombs. Missiles that were launched from planes, etc. Now, these things were just experimented with and so forth, but as so legend goes, in Nazi Germany after the war, there were trains leaving the country, boxcars full of prototypes, patents, reports, you name it. And then, of course, also the scientists that sent us to the moon. That was just the German space program, continued. And so all of these things, for all of that, what I've just mentioned is the thing that gives people thought. They can say, well, if they had jets like the Me-262, and all these kind of things, they had jet aircraft, but of course they were never really used, but they had them. And so then that makes people think, well, maybe they did have alternative propulsion, alternative energy sources. We know they're extremely interested in that because that is what caused them to do many of the things they did, with the lack of energy, lack of oil. That's why they needed to get into Russia to get to those oil fields in the Caucasus, et cetera. And for example, they had no oil. So what did they do? They invented synthetic oil, which a lot of people use in their cars today. And they had alternative energy. They could run a tank on a lump of coal. They made a new kind of engine that we use the same engine, but the way the energy was delivered to it was an alternative, where they used some alternative fuel, things like that. But people knew that, and so that then tweaks the imagination to think, there's flying saucers. And the pro-Nazi kind of post-war enthusiasts, nutcase, whatever you want to call them, embraced that idea. Say, yes, the Nazis had all this great superior technology and they were da-da-da. And so they embraced these strange, weird, and occult ideas about the sub-Antarctic Nazi bases and all kinds of things that can be ascribed to science fiction or imaginative. Hitler survived, all that kind of stuff, becomes a part of the occult mentality of the post-war world. And where there's smoke, there's fire. People think, well, there's something there. There could be a whole lot more that we just don't know about. And that's one of the theories about UFOs in general in this country. When did we start seeing UFOs? Well, it was immediately after the war. Where did we see them? Well, in Washington State and in New Mexico. They become pretty thick. Well, what do we have there? We have proving grounds. We have Boeing up in Seattle, et cetera. They were bringing these prototypes. So one theory goes for and testing them. They had things like there was a plane, that was a flying wing, that resisted detection by radar that the English had, et cetera. And so a lot of the things that we later perfected were indeed originally German prototypes, which is not surprising when you think, well, Germany had more Nobel Prize winners. It had more PhDs per capita of any country in the world at the inception of the war. So then you take a country that has that kind of capacity intellectually and put it under existential pressure, you're going to come up with some ideas, which they did. And they are all still being used. Yeah. We don't know what else were in those boxcars that may be in the next on the line,
Right. But, yeah. So I know that we're kind of running out of time here, but I have just a couple more questions for you, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. So one, I'm going to kind of join the two questions together. There's this idea that's in some of this occult literature that there was a massive attempt, I think, and part of the volkish movement, I believe, there's this idea that there was this massive attempt to sort of restore or recreate German paganism. And you note that there wasn't this large scale. And I want to ask you to comment on that and then take us back to the positive Christianity, because that is the only religion stated in the official program of the National Socialist Party.
So, yeah, there was that. So let's go, and the studies have been made, good ones, that there was probably around 4 million people in Germany who were considered themselves neo-pagans, pagans who were actually interested in the reviving of the ancestral religion, if you will, of the Germanic peoples, et cetera. But that's a pretty small minority, 80 or 70 or million people we're talking about. But it is a sizable number, and it's part of that reform movement. But who those people were and what they believed is very diverse. Some who just were paganized Jesus, that's the Aryan Christ. And that's part of the positive Christianity idea that Jesus wasn't Jewish, blah, 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 all that kind of thing. So it runs the gamut from that kind of pagan Christianity to people who actually sort of were wanting to revive the old religion, which were pretty small in number. And because the German world, whatever, the world just wasn't ready to really understand that. I am myself an Odinist and a Germanic heathen. So I study these things with special interest, and will note that the Nazis, for example, and the god of scholars in Nazi Germany said, oh, that would be great, but and as he appears in the Eddas, in the actual literature of the Old Norse literature, is just too damned weird and dark and strange and unmanly, kind of, he does bizarre and weird things. He's got to be from a foreign country. He can't be a real German god, which they would see as a kind of a Wagnerian Zeus, with a horned helmet or something, right? The world had learned enough about Germanic paganism in a real way to be able to embrace it with any kind of knowledge. So it was generally rejected. Hitler says, "Oh, these men in the beard and the whole, old believing in the old gods, it just ruins it for me. That's crazy." That's completely rejected. Himmler and others were more interested, but again, it was not really in a position to be embraced. It just they wouldn't accept what the myths actually told them. It was just they were part of a 19th century manly man kind of a view of what the spiritual life should be. And so they were completely unprepared for actual Germanic paganism. So that really didn't get much of any kind of distance. People like Guido von List in Austria prior to in the First World War, he died in 1919. I'm a scholar of Guido von List, translated some of his works and so forth. And studying him is very interesting because you see that before he died, before the end of the First World War, he had positive things to say about Jewish people and the Kabbalah and how the people acted together and kind of shared ideas and about Freemasonry and so forth and so on. But then after the war and after he died, after the First World War and after he died, his followers who continued on with his organization would apologize for some of his previous writings because he just didn't know that the Freemasons were a Jewish conspiracy, or he's had these positive things to say about the Jews and he just didn't know. And so the whole world of this kind of neo-pagan world had a substantial and fundamental change after the First World War. Again, going back to that trauma of the end of the First World War and how it changed the country of Germany and its whole attitude towards the rest of the world. And this was affected. Their ideas about all of these things were deeply affected by these events. And so that changed things quite a bit. And so the whole idea of neo-paganism or embracing the old traditions, et cetera, over such a few decades really went through massive changes, differences, and so forth. But there was no, people want to say, I remember some commentator on the news when Ratzinger, the guy who was elected to be Pope, and so forth. People say, well, Hitler, he was a member of the Hitler Youth, blah, blah, blah. And he says, that was a pagan movement anyway. He just, that was just blind. He was obviously a Roman Catholic. But anyway, he was just, again, that was one of the moments where I said, this is what's going on. They want to dismiss the Nazis as being pagan or satanic or whatever, not us, and so that was really just an illustration of that point. And so that was really part and parcel of the times.
Well, thank you for that. And
sure.
I think I would love to speak with you sometime about the German myths. And I know you've done work on the runes. I think that would be absolutely fascinating. The last thing with this positive Christianity and Christianity in general, didn't the National Socialists also use Christian imagery in their propaganda?
Now, right. The positive Christianity was a part of the National Socialist movement mentioned in the 25 points, and also they were a group, and I have pictures and stuff like that of them in the book, and their fundamental idea was that Jesus was a German, was a Aryan. His father was named Pantera, a Roman soldier, and forth and so on. And he was actually not Jewish, etc. But a lot of it was sort of positive in the sense that they would go, and a lot of this was rooted in biblical criticism of the 19th century, deconstructing biblical texts, was saying this is not what it appears to be. It's not true. It's something else is true, etc. So these people were denigrating, bringing down religion, which they thought was important in the Nazis, because with their real agenda positive Christianity is a stage. Other things might be also part of it. But what they wanted to do was create so that the National Socialism is to become our religion, and that we are going to embrace that ideology as the new religion. But we cannot just reject Jesus, Christianity, etc., outright, because the masses still believe in it, and so we can't do that. That's too radical. That's counterproductive to our agenda of manipulating the masses. Right? You manipulate your friends, not your. If you alienate them, you're going to start losing them. Right. So you always see it in a Christian context, at least, as far as just your verbiage is concerned, so that you're not rejecting Jesus or the church, so you work with them while trying to, at the same time, to undermine them. Although, of course, the churches, both Lutheran and Catholic, were cooperative with the Nazis on many levels. And of course, after the war, it's like, oh, what? We never had anything to do with that. We were persecuted by the Nazis, etc. But history shows that it was not quite that simple, especially then in the larger context of the centuries of anti-Semitism on both sides, of the Lutheran and Catholic. But Christianity was considered to be, I guess you could put it, that it's kind of like the gateway to ultimate aim of equating National Socialism with the total spiritual life of the nation. And so that was clearly the ultimate aim and goal. They didn't want to be subject. Obviously, Hitler and the party doesn't want to be subject to criticism by the church. So we put them together. And that's what Hitler created what was called a Concordia of state and church. And it's the one that Germany still uses today. The way in which your tax money in Germany is distributed to the churches, you don't tithe, you don't go to the church, it's paid in a church tax. The only way out of that tax is to resign officially from the church and to perhaps have another one, or atheism or whatever, but you have to resign from the church. It's to get out of that tax or to alter it. It's a destination of that money. Now, there's only two major Nazi leaders who actually resigned from the church, and those are Himmler and Hess, Rudolf Hess. So that kind of tells you statistically, as far as among those major leaders, most of them, retain their church affiliation.
Right. Yeah. And, that brings up a lot of things in my mind, and I will just summarize it as saying there's so much that I think we need to learn by looking very closely to all of these aspects of world history and National Socialism, and I think that's one of the great values of your book. I always kind of rephrase it, but there's a line I steal from a folk song by the singer Suzanne Vega, but I always kind of requote it too. We keep challenging the future with a profound lack of history. And I think we need to get that history in to avoid repetition.
Right, and to be accurate and true in our analysis, and not simply project our propaganda, our own ideologies onto the past.
Right, exactly. Well, Dr. Flowers, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for this conversation. I really appreciated it, and I hope I can speak with you again sometime. I know that you mentioned you're working on another book. Is that going to be out? Do you have a release date or a
No, I'm not. Probably a year away. Okay. The book on Ernst Schertl, I have to have someone else help me with it, because it's going to have a lot of artwork and things like that, and it has to really look good. But my book on the occult roots of Bolshevism is out and available. Okay. And I come out with books quite regularly, and so a lot of things. My whole corpus of available books, it can be found at a website called seekthemysteries.com.
Okay, wonderful. I will put a link. My
Yeah.
So here, seekthemysteries.com.
Plural. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'll put a link for
Okay.
that in the show notes
Yeah.
and the video description. And I will also put a link to the Occult and National Socialism so that
Mm-hmm.
people can that. And I can put a link into for the occult roots of
Yeah.
Bolshevikism.
Bolshevism. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Bolshevism. Okay.
Yeah, it's a pretty good companion to it in the sense that it's different ideas and everything, but things that we are that would be worth thinking about. You know?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think this is all very important work, and I am so grateful that you've done this. So thank you again. I really appreciated
Thank you.
this. And I hope to be able to speak with you later.
I look forward to it.
All right.
And that's a wrap on episode 63 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you are part of my YouTube audience or watch this on Spotify. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to give it a positive rating on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts. It only takes a second, and your 5-star ratings really do help, especially if you listen on Apple. If you have a moment to spare, please consider posting a short but positive review. And please subscribe. For those viewing on YouTube, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you will be informed when I upload new content. If you think a friend, family member, or coworker might like this podcast, please share it with them. Right now, that is one of the best ways to help me with this podcast. I really do need to grow my audience. And for anyone else who would like to contribute to this podcast and support my work here on Rebel Spirit Radio, I have officially launched a Patreon. There are currently 4 levels of membership: Seeker, Sage, Adept, and Guru. Some of the perks available include early access to videos, shoutouts to members, a members-only Facebook page, access to the Rebel Spirit Radio Discourse server, a monthly book club, and the opportunity to join me and special guests for a monthly cocktail apocalypse, happy hour at the end of the world. You can find the link for the Patreon in the show notes or video description. And of course, if you'd like to make a one-time donation, you can still do so via PayPal. So be sure to follow Rebel Spirit Radio on Facebook and or sign up for the newsletter at rebelspiritradio.com so you can be informed of all future live events. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.